Rome. At its height, Rome was the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced. Roman legions had conquered Gaul, crushed Carthage, and pushed the known world's borders to places most Romans could not even name. The empire stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the cold forests of Britain, and it held together because Roman soldiers held it together. Men who were born Roman, raised Roman, and died Roman. That was the foundation. Then Rome decided the foundation was too expensive to maintain. It started reasonably enough. The empire had grown so large that maintaining a professional citizen army across every frontier simultaneously became a logistical nightmare. Hiring foreign warriors, Germanic tribesmen, Goths, Vandals, Huns, men who already knew how to fight and were willing to do it for pay, seemed like an elegant solution. Rome had the money, these men had the muscle. Everyone benefited. The arrangement worked well enough for long enough that Rome stopped questioning it entirely. Here is where the hidden flaw lived. A Roman soldier fighting for Rome had something to lose. A Germanic mercenary fighting for Rome had a paycheck. The moment the paycheck felt uncertain, or the moment a better offer appeared, the loyalty evaporated completely. And Rome, increasingly dependent on these foreign fighters, had no replacement ready. The citizen soldier who had conquered the ancient world had been slowly phased out. The men who now held the borders were the same men Rome had once conquered. They remembered that too. By the late 4th century, entire units of the Roman army were effectively Gothic armies wearing Roman uniforms. Their commanders were Gothic. Their loyalties were complicated. When Alaric, a Gothic general who had actually served Rome, felt disrespected and underpaid one too many times, he did not quit. He marched. In 410 AD, Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome itself. The first time in 800 years a foreign enemy had breached the city's walls. The men tearing Rome apart were the men Rome had hired to protect it. The outsourcing had come full circle, with catastrophic precision. The Western Empire limped on for a few more decades, each year more dependent on the same mercenary system that was actively consuming it. In 476 AD, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, himself a former Roman military commander, simply deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, and did not bother appointing a replacement. There was no dramatic final battle, no last stand. Rome did not fall to an unstoppable enemy. It dissolved because it had quietly handed its survival to people who had no reason to care whether it survived, and then acted surprised when they did not. The Aztecs. Tenochtitlan in 1519 was one of the largest cities on Earth. Built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by massive causeways, home to perhaps 200,000 people, it was a marvel of engineering and power that would have stunned any European visitor. The Aztec Empire controlled much of central Mexico through a combination of military dominance and carefully maintained terror. Human sacrifice was not a side practice. It was state policy, designed to remind every subject people exactly what the Aztecs were capable of. This was an empire that understood power completely. And then 500 Spanish soldiers walked through the front door. Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican coast in 1519 with roughly 500 men, 16 horses, and a collection of cannons that the Aztecs had never seen before. Emperor Moctezuma II received reports of these strangers and faced a decision that would define everything that followed. What is not debated is that Moctezuma hesitated when he should have acted, and that hesitation cost everything. Cortés was invited into Tenochtitlan in November of 1519. He walked into the greatest city in the Americas as a guest. Moctezuma greeted him personally. The Aztecs fed the Spanish, housed them, and showed them the city's treasures. From the outside, this looks incomprehensible. From inside the logic of the moment, it made a terrible kind of sense. Cortés had already demonstrated that he could not be easily stopped. He had fought through multiple local peoples on his way inland, winning battles against forces that vastly outnumbered him. He had also been recruiting aggressively among peoples who resented Aztec rule. Moctezuma was watching a stranger arrive with unknown weapons, unknown allies, and unknown intentions. Inviting him in to be observed and controlled seemed more manageable than provoking a confrontation on uncertain terms. The flaw was that Cortés had no intention of being controlled. Within weeks, he had taken Moctezuma hostage inside his own palace. The emperor who had commanded the sacrifice of thousands now sat in his own throne room as a prisoner of 500 foreigners. The psychological collapse of Aztec authority happened faster than any military defeat could have caused it. When Moctezuma appeared before his own people to calm a growing rebellion, they reportedly pelted him with stones. He died shortly after. Either way, the man who had ruled an empire was finished. Cortés regrouped, gathered his indigenous allies, who now numbered in the tens of thousands, and returned with a full siege. Tenochtitlan fell in August of 1521 after months of brutal urban warfare, starvation, and smallpox. The greatest city in the Americas was reduced to rubble. The Aztec Empire had been undone, in part because its emperor had chosen to talk when he should have fought, and by the time fighting became the only option, it was already too late. The Qing Dynasty. In the early 19th century, the Qing dynasty of China still operated on a foundational belief that had served Chinese civilization for thousands of years. China was the center of the world. Foreign nations were peripheral, tributary, and fundamentally inferior. This was not arrogance for its own sake. It was a worldview built on genuine historical precedent. China had been the most sophisticated civilization on Earth for stretches of time that made European history look brief. The problem was that while they were looking inward, the world had been quietly transformed by something they had not anticipated and did not respect. Emperor Qianlong's famous 1793 letter to King George III explained that China possessed all things in abundance and had no need of foreign manufacturers. This was not an unreasonable position in 1793. It became a catastrophic one within 50 years. The First Opium War began in 1839. British steam-powered warships destroyed Chinese junks using naval technology centuries behind what was being deployed against them. Qing soldiers, armed with weapons familiar to their ancestors, faced artillery, rifles, and military organization they had no framework to counter. China lost decisively and was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, handing Hong Kong to Britain and opening treaty ports to foreign control. The Qing response was to largely continue doing what they had been doing. The Second Opium War came in 1856. Foreign armies burned the old Summer Palace in Beijing in 1860, one of the most magnificent architectural complexes in human history, reduced to ash as a deliberate act of humiliation. By the time the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 brought a coalition of 8 foreign nations marching into Beijing itself, the Qing dynasty was a hollow institution. The dynasty fell in 1912. An empire that had stood for millennia collapsed in part because its rulers could not accept that the rules had changed while they were not watching. Napoleon. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the largest army ever assembled in European history. The Grande Armée numbered around 600,000 men. Napoleon had already redrawn the map of Europe multiple times and was, by any reasonable measure, the greatest military commander of his age. When Tsar Alexander I began violating the continental system, the economic blockade Napoleon had designed to strangle Britain, Napoleon decided the solution was straightforward. He would march into Russia, win a decisive battle, and force Alexander back into compliance. It would be over before winter. Russia refused to cooperate. The Russian army retreated rather than offering the decisive engagement Napoleon needed, drawing the Grand Army deeper into Russian territory, while supply lines grew longer, thinner, and more fragile with every mile. Napoleon kept advancing because stopping meant admitting the campaign had already gone wrong. The French reached Moscow in September and found it on fire. The Russians had burned their own city rather than surrender it intact. Napoleon sat in the ruins for 5 weeks, waiting for Alexander to negotiate. Alexander did not negotiate. Russia's size was itself a weapon. There was always more territory to retreat into, and the French army was not designed to occupy an infinite country indefinitely. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat in October, winter arrived with a ferocity that turned a military withdrawal into a slow-motion catastrophe. Men who had marched into Russia in summer uniforms were walking through snow and ice with no food and no shelter. Horses died in the thousands. Soldiers who fell behind were killed by Cossack raiders or simply froze where they stopped. The Grande Armée returned with somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 men. The units that had defined French military dominance for a decade had been erased not by a superior army, but by distance, cold, starvation, and a Russian strategic decision to simply refuse to let Napoleon have the war he wanted. Within 2 years, Napoleon was in exile. The man who had conquered Europe had been defeated by a country that simply walked away from him until he destroyed himself.